After deciding not to go to NYU or Northwestern, I settled on the University of Missouri, where I met my future wife-to-be, Deanne Wallendorf. After going together for 6 or 8 months, we decided to get married. We went on our honeymoon to St. Louis for the first night and then to Brainerd, Minnesota. It was a beautiful camp on a lake. We played golf, we rode horseback, swam in the lake, and it was a wonderful place to have a honeymoon. Then we came back and Deanne continued in school. I didn't have enough money to put her through school, so I went to Jake and asked him if he would pay us the same amount he paid to the sorority that Deanne was in. Even in Jefferson City or Fort Worth, I'd get a job selling to the public. I went to Missouri and then got a job selling air conditioning units in Jefferson City and spent June and July and part of August selling air conditioners. I was not too successful, but I did make a few sales, and then we spent the rest of the summer before we went back to school with Aunt Billy and Uncle Frank in Fort Worth. The following year, my last year of school, Deanne got a job at the school library, and between what I got from the GI Bill and one of the first mortgages that Uncle Frank had saved from me when I had paid some money gambling in the service, and what Deanne made in the school library, we had a total income of $375 a month. The amazing thing was we were able to save nearly $1,000, which is the most I think we ever saved in our whole life from our actual salaries and outside income. We had rented a nice little furnished apartment that was partially owned and managed by Mickey McGinn's uncle. It was very satisfactory. We had a great time and happy beginning to our marriage and disappointing party. After graduating from college, President Truman came and gave the address, commencement address. Very interesting. Then moved to Chicago, where I joined Grand Advertising executive director. Had a very nice apartment, 24 Lakeshore Drive, which is reasonably close to where I was working from Arlington. Then Deanne went around the same building calling on different companies looking for a job. So we both worked together. She got a job at the mattress setting cotton. Called at that time we manufactured Kleenex and personal products. It's now called Kimberly Clark. She had a very responsible job and did it extremely well. Received 3 promotions during the 9 months we were there because her job was so interesting. I was in the research department of Grand Advertising, the media department, as an assistant account executive for 9 months. And that's all I spent in Chicago before I was transferred to Canada. But that's the second story. While in Chicago, we'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get a starting time and wait 2 hours to play golf. We met every day for lunch, and in one 8 or 9 month period, we both put on about 20 pounds because we were having such big lunches and everything was very exciting in Chicago. And Billy and Uncle Frank came up to visit us and spent a week with us, and Gertrude and Jay came at Christmas time and also at Thanksgiving. As I said, I was transferred to Toronto, Canada to take a 6-month training course, after which I was to be transferred to either Rio or Bogota, Colombia, to work on the Colgate-Palmolive account. We had a small portion of the account in Canada, Cashmere Bouquet soap and cosmetics. And I was training under a man named Jim Allworth, who was an American, half Indian, and really a wild man. Matter of fact, an interesting story was my first day at the office in Toronto. I wasn't prepared for the little rickety elevator to take me up to the 3rd floor. I came in and no one was there, so I waited a few minutes, and it was turned 9 o'clock and still no one was there, so I opened the main office door to the office. The reception area was outside, just off the elevator. I said, hello, hello. I went through the main office and found out I was in the media department, and suddenly this old man comes around the corner, and his DVDs all unshaven and everything, and I thought, boy, I'm in the wrong place. I said, I'm looking for Grad Advertising. He was all bleary-eyed as this was a Monday morning. He said, well, this is Grad Advertising. You must be Joe Wren. I said, that's right. He said, well, I'm Dave McMillan, the head of the agency. It turned out that quite a few weekends, Mr. McMillan would go on a bender, and he would end up sleeping people started straggling in. When you have a guy like that running the office, people don't feel that they have to be there on time. I think the whole office was there by 10 o'clock. I met Jim Allworth and went to work on the Colgate account, which I really enjoyed. Except Jim had a typical Indian problem. If he had a couple of drinks at lunch time, he kind of went crazy. One day he got mad at the meeting director and threw a chair out the window of the office. This was my initiation to the hinterlands of the advertising business. About June 1st, Mr. Grant called up Mr. McMillan and said, I'm transferring Jim Allworth to New York. You'll have to find someone new for the Colgate account. Mr. McMillan passed this word on to Colgate, and they'd say, we don't want you to get someone new. We want Joe Wren, who's been working with Jim all winter, to be our account executive. Naturally, that really puffed me up because I really didn't even think. They hardly knew I was alive. I was just a bag carrier for Jim. So I went in when Mr. McMillan told me that and said, yes, I'm going to offer you the job. And I said, took a deep breath and said, well, are you going to increase my salary? He said, yes, I am. It's going to pay you $375 a month. Since I was making $250 a month, that was really a big raise, a 50% raise, and started working on the Colgate account. Then by October, Mr. Grant still wanted to transfer me to Rio. So he had sent up a young man named Gordon Effer to work with me on the Colgate account. And all of a sudden, Mr. McMillan passed away over the weekend. This would have been in September, so Mr. Grant sent up Fred Spence, who was a super guy, to run the office for an interim period because Mr. McMillan had opened Grant Advertising in Canada and was very locked into most of the products other than Colgate and Old Dutch Cleanser. So they were trying to salvage Canada Packers in Canada. So Grant came up in late September, so Spence came up late in September and took over the office. Spence and I got along very well, and when they went to tell Colgate that they were going to make Gordon Effer the new account executive and transfer me, they listened to it, and all of a sudden, after Spence and Effer and myself had left, about 4 hours later, we get this panic phone call from Mr. Grant, who said, I've just gotten this phone call from Colgate, and they said that they are going to take the business away if you take Joe Wren off the account. To make a long story short, they decided to leave me here and give me some other business to have. The next June, Fred Spence called me in and said, Joe, Mr. Grant wants to transfer me. You've been here as long as anyone, and I wonder if you can recommend someone to take over the Toronto office. He wants to get a new head of the agency in Toronto and a new president. Can you think of anybody you might recommend? I went back in, called Deanne and said, listen to this. And I went over the whole story. I said, you know, I think I could run this agency. What do you think if I go back in and suggest that I could do it and they should make me president? She said first that I was nuts. I'd been there less than a year and so forth. At the end, I said, well, what have I got to lose? She agreed that all they could say was no and go on looking for someone else. So I went in and I said, I think I've got the perfect person. Fred said, who's that? I said, me. We talked about it for a while, and he said, you know, you've got the most important account, Colgate, and they think you're great. I'll speak to Mr. Grant about it and see what he thinks. This was about 1 o'clock. About 4:30, Fred called me back in the office, stuck out of his hand, and said, congratulations, I just spoke to Mr. Grant, and you've got the job. Well, I nearly fell flat on the floor. Here I am, 26 years old, and going to take over the agency. Not that we were that big of an agency, as we only had, at that time, about 12 people in the office, which then wound down to 6 people with 2 accounts left. But we did keep Colgate, Old Dutch, and I was able to pick up Glidden Paint. That's it. And after the Mickey and Carolyn wedding, I asked Deanne if she would marry me. She was kind of back and forth on it a bit, but finally said yes before I went back to Fort Worth for Christmas vacation and to tell Aunt Billy and Uncle Frank of my plans. We had planned to get married on May 29th, 1948, and everything worked out perfectly. We had after getting married, we went on our honeymoon to St. Louis for our wedding night, and then to Brainerd, Minnesota for our honeymoon. It was a beautiful camp on a lake, and we had our own private cottage with a lovely main building where you ate, and they had recreational facilities. We played a lot of golf, we rode horseback, swam in the lake, and just in general it was a wonderful place to have a honeymoon. When we came back, and we decided Deanne only had 1 year left in school. I didn't have enough money to put her through school, so I went to Jake, my father-in-law, and asked him if he would pay us the same amount he paid to the sorority that Deanne was in. He agreed, so Deanne was able to finish school and get her degree. That summer, I worked in Jefferson City and got a job selling to the public. This was suggested by a member of Grant Advertising that I'd been to see in Chicago. I sold air conditioners through the months of June and July, and part of August. I was not too successful, but I did make a few sales, and then we spent the rest of the summer before going back to school with Aunt Billy and Uncle Frank in Fort Worth, where they really got to know Deanne. We had lived with Jake and Gertrude through the summer, so our expenses were not too high. The following year, my last year in school, Deanne got a job at the school library, and between what I got from my GI Bill, what she made at the library, and one time when I had made a big gambling score in the Army, Uncle Frank had purchased me a first mortgage. We were able to make ends meet. As a matter of fact, out of a total income of $375 a month, we were able to save nearly $1,000 during that year, which is really the most that we ever saved out of just my income, I think, in our whole lives. We had rented a nice little furnished apartment that was partially owned and managed by Mickey McKim's uncle. It was terribly hot in that fall and spring, and we faced west. Unfortunately, there was no air conditioning in those days in this building. All in all, though, it was very satisfactory, and we had a great time and happy beginning to our marriage in this apartment. I then graduated from college in June, and President Truman gave our graduation address, which was quite exciting. In Chicago, I trained there and then was transferred to Canada, where I worked on the Colgate-Palmolive account. Through a series of events that were totally unexpected, I was able to have an opportunity to become the head account executive on Colgate-Palmolive, and then when a few months later the president of the agency unexpectedly passed away, and I'll get into that in more detail later, I got the possible opportunity to become the head of the agency. So after being asked, could I recommend someone, I went in and recommended myself. About that time, Fred Spence turned to me and said, I just spoke to Mr. Grant, and you are now the president of the agency. Went on down to 6 people, because then 2 more accounts left. But we did keep Colgate's, Old Dutch, and I was able to pick up Glidden Paints and Blue Ribbon, spices, coffee, and chocolates. So we were billing somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000. One of the first things I wanted to do was our lease was coming up, and I wanted to move into a little better part of town. Couldn't afford a big office in one of the newer buildings that were just starting to go up, but we did find a small office in a much nicer part of town, right next to Simpson's, the big department store on Richmond Street, which has now been torn down and is part of the big Sheraton Hotel complex down there. But we were there from 1952 to 57. In 54, we were able to buy another Colgate agency. Colgate's had 4 agencies, and we got the opportunity to buy an agency called L.J. Hagerty. And Mr. Hagerty, or Lee Hagerty, was one of the most unusual people I ever met in my life. But I was very fortunate that I got to train with him for a couple of years, because he joined our agency, and I was the president and he was the chairman, but we had equal responsibility. But I got to work with him for 2 years. In many ways, he was a terrible man. He had awful ulcers, and they would drive him crazy, and he would throw the telephone. He would do all sorts of wild things. But as far as supermarket marketing, hadn't met, and I never did meet anyone that knew more about the marketing products through supermarkets, because he had the Colgate. He actually sold to some of the supermarkets himself. And then he got us the Steinberg account in Montreal, and I got to sit on their marketing committee for a whole year, and that was an invaluable experience. Although we didn't make any real money, we just continued to kind of break even through this period. It was a great experience for me. So things rocked along. We finally got into the profit position around 1956, where we were making a fair profit. Our billings were up to about $2.5 million. And then in 1960, we got the opportunity to, against 3 other agencies, to present for a portion of the Chrysler Canada account, which took place in 1959. We put on a real big presentation with our Detroit office, and I spent maybe in a 2-month period, I spent probably 6 weeks in Windsor and Detroit preparing for this presentation. And we made it, and lo and behold, we won it. And automatically, overnight, we more than doubled our size. At that time, the president of Chrysler was Ron Todgham, and the vice president marketing was Sid Hurley. And this is part of another story, but joining Chrysler within 2 months of our getting the account was a man named Don Lander, who worked in the sales department, and Mo Kloss, who went into the parts and service department from General Motors. So I met everyone there between the time we got the account in June or July of 1959, and actually we introduced the 1960 model, because those were the days where they had the big model introductions, changed all the cars every year, where now they change them about every 10 years, it looks like. And whenever they come up with a new car, they just bring it out. They don't wait for the big presentations. But we had big dealer shows, dancing girls, and put on, took a show all across the country that was just as big a show as if it was a Broadway musical. And I always took Deanne and the kids down to the shows when we played Toronto, but we would usually play Montreal, Toronto, either Winnipeg, Calgary, or Edmonton, and Vancouver out in the west. So by doubling the office, the size, now we did have to move. So we moved into a new building at the corner of Adelaide and University, took the whole floor, and we really became, for the first time, somewhat of a force in the advertising business. The scary thing that happened was that then a year later, our U.S. agency lost the Dodge account in the United States. So everyone automatically thought we would lose the business in Canada because this is the way things seemed to work. After sweating it out for a couple of months and doing everything we could to hold on to the business, I had just broken my leg at that time, or my kneecap, and was going back and forth in a big cast. And one day I got a call from Sid Hurley. It said, asked me to be down at in Windsor at 8 o'clock the next morning. Well, I couldn't fly. I had to go on the train with this big cast on the overnight train, and because I couldn't get there in time. And I remember it had already been planned. Fred Spence was coming to Toronto just on his yearly visit, and we were taking Jim and Billy, Deanna and I were taking Jim and Billy Stevenson, the president of Colgate's, and his wife out for dinner when I get this call about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So we took them to dinner, and then I left them, the four of them, Fred and Deanne and Jim and Billy, at the restaurant, and went over and caught the train at Union Station to go to Windsor, not knowing. I knew I was going down to find out whether I had lost the business or kept the business, and being an eternal optimist, I having a good time, and except for my broken leg. But that was a miserable train ride. I don't think I slept 2 hours. It's tough enough to sleep on the train at any time, but if you got a broken leg and you can't turn over and you're cast, and you can't, yeah, it did. It went the whole way because they had to keep the knee immobile, the joint below. And I know whenever Larry, who was about 2 at the time, I guess, and he always wanted to walk around with my cane because he really enjoyed that. Yeah. That's right. So, Deanne joined over at we were members of the Toronto Cricket Club, which then amalgamated with the Toronto Curling and Skating Club. And then they built a big new clubhouse with a curling rink and a big ice skating rink and a cricket field and everything. So we were curling, but then when they got the skating rink open, Deanne joined something called the Morning Glories, where they were learning how to skate. Well, I'd skated 3 or 4 times, I guess, in my life back in Texas. So they were, and I roller skated, sure. But they were having a party, a skating party, and the Morning Glories were all going to show how much they had learned. So Dan made me get a pair of skates, and I'd never skated with a pair with those pick things on the front. They're figure skates, not hockey skates. I'd only, when I had skated, which had been seldom. Well, as usual, after I got them on and found out I could stand up, I was out I kept having to do each time I went around, I'd get bored unless I did something better or different or faster or tried to jump or something. Anyway, we were going through, they had a Paul Jones, and you were going under the bridges, and I slipped, and the person I was going under the bridge grabbed me, and of course, Deanne had hold of my other arm because we were going through together, and so my whole weight fell on my left kneecap, and like you always do, it doesn't hurt, and I went on skating, but then the next morning I couldn't even get my pajamas off. I had to cut my pajamas off because I had completely fractured the kneecap, shattered the kneecap. So we called Dr. Pierce, who was Deanne's doctor and the children's doctor, and she got a doctor named Dr. Joint, which was a great name, down at Toronto Western, who was the head orthopedic man. And he took the x-rays, and he came in, and he said, was holding them up to the light and said, well, Mr. Wren, I'm afraid we're going to have to take your kneecap out. Well, immediately jumped into my mind I was going to have a stiff leg for the rest of my life, because I didn't know that, I thought the kneecap was essential. That's when I found out that if I was willing to work hard enough at it and exercise hard enough, that I would be able to get 95 to 98% of the flexion or the bending back into my knee. So I said, okay, let's take a shot, and I was about 4 or 5 months of physiotherapy, of working on it, and going down and taking whirlpool baths, and then trying to bend it a little more. And I think what really did it was I went back, we went to Florida, and I had to fly back early, and Deanne stayed down with, we came back, we had to train, that was a different year. Came back, we had to change planes in New York, and in those days they didn't have the great ramps that they put out, they just had these steep steps. So I'm going down the steps holding on to one of the kids, and a big gust of wind came, and I either was going to fall flat on the tarmac, I had about 5 steps left, or walk on down. And so I walked on down, and that it really hurt, but it broke, I guess, the end of the adhesions, because from there on it went. And I never did understand why they didn't just knock you out and break the adhesions themselves, but the doctor said that unless you did it yourself, the odds were that you would always have a lag, because it's just like a rubber band, and if you stretch it too far, then it never goes back into full shape. Back to Windsor in the cast. We did digress a little far afield there. So I'm sitting down in the director of marketing's office. I said, what's going to happen? He said, I don't know. He said, they haven't told me yet, but I know that you're here, that the head of the other agency, Ross Roy, is here, and they're with him right now. And the head of a new agency, BBDO, is going to be showing up here any minute. Well, the other guy showed up, and he said, I do not know what's going to happen. They were a big New York agency who had gotten the Dodge account away from us in the United States. So they obviously thought a lot of them in the United States. So that kind of gave me a sinky feeling. Like, yeah, they had an office in Canada. So I sitting there, and about that time, the intercom buzzer went off on Gene Irwin's, was this guy's name, desk, and he flipped his button, and Ron Todgham came on, and he said, Gene, you got that one-legged Texan down there. And Gene said, he's sitting right here. He said, well, send him on up. And I was 99% sure it was good news, or I wouldn't have gotten such a way of being asked to come up. So I went up, and they were all sitting in there, and what they had done, they had fired Ross Roy, their old agency in Canada, and had moved us over to the Chrysler Plymouth account, and were giving the Dodge account to BBDO, the one that had just gotten in the States. So as time went on, that was our, your cars are cars, and he had the same people, could work, just move over and work on the other cars. So that, of course, then became our cornerstone account, and as I move through the business career, we got other accounts. We finally, then in 1972, I became executive vice president of the international company, and started traveling, long before that, 1968. And the first big project I went on was to go to, we did not have an office in Australia. We were in 33 countries around the world. And my first big project was to go out and see whether we could buy an agency in Australia. So my first trip to Australia was the second time that Pan American had ever flown nonstop from Honolulu to Sydney, and that was quite exciting because it's an awful long way from Honolulu. It's something like 11 hours or something like that. It took 27 hours to go from Toronto, but changing planes to Sydney. But I found, I really enjoyed the experiences that I got from the job of being the head of international. Eventually, I became president of international. Is irreplaceable because you can go on trips, and it's not at all like when you're going on business and you get to meet the local people and work with them and go to their homes and be a part. You learn a lot about the culture. Well, moving back to a personal story, back in 1962, Deanne and I had never been out of North America. So YPO, I guess I should jump back and say in 1960, when we had become big enough after getting the Chrysler account, our neighbors from across the street, Darcy and Margot Baconby, who I guess are our best friends, who became our best friends. Darcy belonged to a organization called the Young Presidents Organization. And in order to be a member of the Young Presidents Organization, you had to have become the president and chief executive officer of your company before 40. It had to have a minimum number of employees and had to do more than $2 million at that time in business. Well, Darcy was telling me about it, and I met our company. They had he had a distributing company, and their biggest that was in the laundry and dry cleaning distributors, but they also had the Mercury outboard motor business, which was a several $1 million a year business in Canada. So he introduced me to some of the other members. There were only 20 members in the Ontario chapter at that time. And we joined. I say we, Deanne and I joined because in YPO, your wife goes to the big universities and the area conferences and a few meetings each year. So I joined YPO. Well, in 1962, it was decided that the Northeast Area Conference, which the Ontario chapter was part of the Northeast area, would be held in Lausanne, Switzerland. And it was being hosted by the Ontario chapter. And Ted Buell, the conference chairman, asked me to be the publicity and kind of co-social chairman. Darcy McConvey was social chairman, co-social chairman with Darcy, and we planned the social programs. So we had to take two trips to Switzerland on the planning basis. No, I guess we didn't take trips to Switzerland. This was the Portuguese one. So we didn't ever go to Switzerland. Ted Buell and the education chairman had to go to Switzerland. And we then were going to make our first trip to Europe, and we were going over a week early. The McConveys decided to go over on the Queen Elizabeth because they had never been on a boat, neither had we, but we wanted to spend more time in London, and we would meet them in Switzerland. So we flew over, Deanne and I flew over to London, and we stayed at Claridge's Hotel. I'd always heard of Claridge's Hotel all my life, and it was really the swish place with the doorman with the big top hat. And I didn't think the poor little old boy from Texas was ever going to be in a place like this, but it never had been a place where they warmed the towels, your bath towels. They had hot water running through the pipes that the towels were hung over, so you had warm towels, and just everything was really just as good as we hoped it would be. It's one of those experiences that turns out as good as you hope. And we really enjoyed London. I in particular because of the English background and everything. But we just had a super 4 or 5 days there before we went on to Switzerland, and then we had 3 or 4 days before the conference started, going around to the different places that the social events were going to take place. So we had 2 whole plane loans of, we had chartered 2 jets, a Swiss Air jet and an SAS jet, to fly everyone over to Lausanne. They had to land at Geneva, and then we had to take buses over. But this is the story that Darcy was telling, the only time in his life he's ever been embarrassed, really embarrassed. We were, one of our wind-up